I would like to call upon a very well-respected knowledge keeper, Mr. Albert McLean, who over the past 25 years has worked tirelessly for two-spirited, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer people in not only the community here, but all around the continent. His family hails from Nitchawayashik, Cree Nation up north, and the Métis community of Norway House. MacLeod has led the way for rights and recognition of 25 people in North America, or 2S people. My eyes are like, sorry, I wear contact lenses and they're dry because the air conditioning has been blasting for the last half hour. So my apologies. I was wondering how 25 people could possibly make sense at this point. In North America since 1986, recognizing the importance of Elder Myra Laramie's vision of Two-Spirit in 1990, MacLeod has worked with the LGBTQ indigenous people across the continent to organize under the name Two-Spirit, to remember the honored roles of non-binary gender people in pre-contact indigenous communities and the spiritual role that they were gifted and that they played throughout our history. MacLeod is also recognized as a pioneer in HIV education for Indigenous people. His commitment to 2S people and Indigenous people living with HIV/AIDS is evident in a range of service commitments he has made over the years, including an HIV 101 workshop that he developed and delivered. This education program was instrumental in reducing the stigma experienced by families with HIV/AIDS. I would ask everyone here to join me in welcoming Elder MacLeod.
Thank you, everyone, and I've been invited here to do my closing remarks for this event. And I come from the Paw, and I was just up there this week at the lake, and it's a beautiful lake, Clearwater Lake. And I spent about 6 days by myself on the lake with a bunch of pelicans in my water in front of the house. And there was on a Zoom, national Zoom on health legislation. And I started talking to them, and I was rambling, and then I finally told them, I've been talking to pelicans for 5 days. It was great to talk to some people, but it was great. And I do want to talk about Mary Young, who began the Native Studies here many years ago, and in her book, she talks about going home to the land, and how when she struggled with going back to Indian residential school and university, when she was in blood veins, she would go and sit on this outcrop of rocks. And there, that anxiety, that fear dissipated. And she felt it was coming from those rocks, that those rocks were helping her, healing her. And that's why we need to go home. Whether we live in the city or not. And that's why I repeatedly go home. I invite myself back to the Paw. No one will invite me there, though it is my homeland. But I see that as my inalienable and inherent right as an Indigenous person in Treaty 5. I was involved in the National Inquiry in one of the 9 sub-working groups that wrote the National Action Plan with the federal government, the 2S LGBTQIA+, which in the 231 calls for justice, there are 32 that are specific to Two-Spirit people. And so our team with the federal government, 15 people from across Canada, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, spent 40 weeks continuously through the pandemic, meeting every week to write our report. And so, one of the recommendations in that report is an apology from the 7 churches that ran Indian residential day schools that instill homophobia and transphobia in our communities, whether they are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. And I work with Roger Roulette, who's an Ojibwe language specialist, and he guides me on understanding the deep philosophies embedded in the Indigenous language and the philosophies therein. And he shared a term with me called MMIWG2S. It means given or received from the divine. It implies as human beings we have the capacity, the ability to petition the natural world and the spiritual world for what we need to survive. Many people don't believe in that ability. The ones who did certainly were the Indian agent and the priests that ran Indian residential schools and day schools, because they sought to destroy that knowledge and that belief and that capacity, but they failed. Because it talks to the resilience of Indigenous peoples on this continent and in South America, whose cultures, technologies, science, medicine, philosophies of life evolved over tens of thousands of years. The disruption of 500 years of colonization is over. We are now in a period where we are picking up the knowledge and the tools left by our ancestors for this time. That disruption is over. So, 5 years ago, no one in Canada would have ever believed that that recommendation to have one of the principal churches that ran 75% of Indian residential schools in Canada, the Pope from the Vatican, would come to Canada in July of 2022 and apologize for the harms that that church did to Indigenous children. 5 years ago, no one would have believed that was possible. The thoughts of the survivors of Indian residential schools, the invocations, the petitions to the spiritual world have done their work and made it happen. That is why we had Indian residential schools, to destroy that belief that we had that capacity to make things happen in the world in which we exist. We all carry that, and I certainly tell that to the homeless people of Winnipeg who have never heard that in their life, certainly not in high school education or in university education, that they have the ability and the capacity to petition the spiritual world for what they need to survive. They may be down and out on the street, and I says, I'm going to tell you something you've never heard in your life, but you should always known since the time you were a child that you have that ability. So the Pope is coming this year to Canada. We are working to create an opportunity for Two-Spirit people who were Indian residential school to meet with the Pope to understand the truth of what happened in those schools to LGBTQ, transgender, Indigenous children under the hands of the Indian agent, the Catholic priests and nuns, and the school teachers. We just came through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with the 94 calls for action. In the Ojibwe language, Debwe Temoen means the truth. The subtext to that word is faith and belief. Do we truly believe it's true? And that's the challenge for this group today. Do we truly believe that Canada is invested in genocide against Indigenous peoples in the 21st century? Or is it an idea on a piece of paper? Or is it happening in real time? Helen Biddy Osborne was at the same high school I was in Nepal in 1971. In that fall, she disappeared and was found murdered because a group of 4 men wanted to make a statement to the Indigenous people of the PA that they were inferior to white people. and they could be assaulted and sexually assaulted. And when she said no, and she fought back, she was murdered in 1971. She was a high school student. When Canada tried to impose the Meech Lake Accord in 1990 on Indigenous peoples without consultation, Elijah Harper, who is an MLA in our legislative building, voted no and killed the Meech Lake Accord. When 4 women saw the discrimination, the violence against Indigenous women, they started the movement, Idle No More. One winter afternoon, I was sitting in my apartment wanting to watch TV. I had the thing. My friend comes to my door and she says, "There's a round dance on Portage in Maine." It was February, it was minus 27. And that is the answer today. Are we idled no more? Because I got up, didn't want to. I went down to Portage in Maine, took my camera, and I was dancing on Portage and Maine. And that's what this is all about today. Are we truly tired on a Saturday afternoon? Or is a homeless Indigenous woman in Winnipeg who has to find a place to sleep tonight that is safe? Is she tired? Is a refugee from the Ukraine coming here with 3 children for asylum, is she tired? Or are we tired? When the children's burials were found in Kelowna, Alea McIver, who's a Two-Spirit activist, transgender activist, and Grandma Shingus went to the legislative building and created a sacred fire. For 4 days, and that's what we do. We open that portal to the spiritual world. For 4 days, our government knew that fire was there. Not one of them came out of that building to put tobacco in that fire. There's even a photograph of the premier leaving the legislative building during that fire and not coming towards it at all. He was shortly fired by his party because he was incompetent to lead this province. The next interim premier was invited to a pipe ceremony within weeks on Memorial Boulevard, and he went with residential school survivors to participate in a pipe ceremony, and he sat on the ground in an indication of respect and reverence for the land in which settlers are today, in reverence for the Indigenous people who helped the settlers settle in this territory over 2 centuries. And we now have a new premier who during Pride spoke at the rally but chose not to march in the Pride March and has since been banned from future Pride marches in Winnipeg. Saying this is not a game. This is not a game. Chief Teresa Spence, when she set up her teepee in 2014 behind the Parliament building, she had a vision of how to do some advocacy. She invited the Prime Minister to come to her teepee, and he wiggled like a fish on a hook. He said, "Here's the federal lieutenant governor, he'll go." She said, "No, I want to talk to you. Come into this teepee." He wiggled and wiggled, and eventually it didn't happen. But the meaning of that was, in order to get into the teepee, the Prime Minister of Canada had to bend. And that Prime Minister knew he could not do that, because that would tell the true story of Canada's history, that it was the Indigenous women, it was the land that helped the settlement of this nation. and he could not let that truth be told. The following year, that government fell. This is the process that we're involved in. For mainstream society politicians is to take heed, right? When you are working with Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, we have that ability, we have that knowledge, and the tools that have been left us for this time. So hopefully the Pope will have an audience with a Two-Spirit Indian residential school survivor to understand the damage that had been done to the Two-Spirit community over generations. During the last few years, we met with the National Chief Perry Bellegarde in 2015. We had written letters to the Assembly of First Nations saying, "What are you doing to champion the rights of Two-Spirit people?" So we were called to a special luncheon meeting at the convention center. And I said, there's 3 things that you can do for us. Support international Two-Spirit gatherings, educate First Nations about Two-Spirit people, and establish a Two-Spirit Council at the Assembly of First Nations level. That was in 2015. When Roseanne Archibald was campaigning for national chief, she made a commitment to do exactly that, establish a Two-Spirit Council. A resolution was passed in the last 2 years to do that, which means amending the AFN's charter, because they have the Women's Council, the Elders Council, and the Youth Council. To create a new council, they have to vote, the 640 chiefs of Canada have to vote to create a Two-Spirit Council to amend their charter. That's going to happen the first week of July. I got an email yesterday from AFN inviting me to Vancouver on Monday for the inaugural meeting of the Two-Spirit Council. Today, on Facebook, Roseanne Chief Archibald, the national chief of the AFN, has been suspended from her position. Right? This is where we are. Patriarchy, misogyny, lateral violence, and genocide. What comes of it, I don't know. But again, we can't go back. We can no longer be idle, any one of us, in moving forward. Otherwise, we are complicit in the genocide. In closing, I just want to share with you a statement from Justice Robert Jackson, the U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, the closing statement of those trials. And I call this statement, "But dead they are." It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow as they beg of you, "Say I slew them not." And the queen replied, "Then say they were not slain, but dead they are." If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, there are no slain, and there has been no crime. So for the surviving family members of murdered and missing and Two-Spirit people in our country, if they are not dead because of colonial genocide, then show them to me today as live, living human beings. And that cannot be done. Thank you.